weeks doing civil rights stuff, which actually acts as a pretty good transition between the 1950s and the 1960s. As a result, the civil rights stuff you covered for the 60s is not really going to be dealt with in much detail here. On the same page, next week we're going to be focusing on Vietnam, so while it is clearly an integral part of the 1960s, I'm not really going to dive too deep into it here, other than just, thing X is a result of Vietnam. In fact, the picture you see on the right is partially a result of the Vietnam War. We'll talk about that towards the end of today. As I said in the intro to this, the 1960s are one of the most eventful periods in American history. And if we were in class, this would be a different story. But for your own sanity, I'm not going to give you like a 4-hour discourse on everything that happens at home in America in the 1960s. So think of this as sort of a greatest hits. So we are going to go from the Camelot of the beginning of the Kennedy administration up through the chaos that is the end of the Johnson and the beginning of the Nixon administration today. So play along with your notes, and there will be a quiz at the end. And like last time, I will throw in some comment here that will lead to an extra credit question if you're paying attention. So let's get rolling. John F. Kennedy is going to be elected president in 1960. John F. Kennedy is a relatively new senator from the state of Massachusetts. He is a war hero from the Second World War. He was a PT boat. It's a patrol torpedo boat. In the Pacific, he saved a number of his crewmen after their boat I guess it's a boat, was sunk. Wrote a book about it. His dad is very rich. His dad was also the former U.S. ambassador to England prior to World War II, where he was a little too in favor of Germany. And also his dad was a bootlegger, which is where a lot of their money came from. That money will come into play in a minute. He's running against Dwight Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Nixon. We talked about him a little bit a while ago. He was the one that went over to Russia and argued with Nikita Khrushchev there. So, how does this relatively unassuming, not particularly well-grounded in social issues guy become the president over someone who'd been the vice president for the last 8 years? The answer is sort of twofold. One, and if you really want, you can watch. The entire debate is up on C-SPAN. I don't really think it's worth your time, but hey, you're bored, you're stuck at home, why not? They engage in America's first televised TV debate. Prior to that, you would go and either debate from sort of city to city, or you would have, more recently, debates on the radio. But what happens here is the debate is televised. Richard Nixon is feeling a little under the weather, shows up at the last minute, doesn't want any makeup put on, whereas John Kennedy shows up well beforehand, has makeup put on, and is just generally a handsome dude. And what comes out of this, despite the fact that, like it says up here, they have pretty similar platforms. They both want to cut down on communism and keep the very well-paying, profitable America of the 1950s chugging forward. JFK wins over the TV audience. He has a little more charisma about him. He looks calm, whereas Nixon is sweaty, has a 5 o'clock shadow at this point, isn't wearing makeup, and just looks sort of sick. So Nixon wins the radio audience, which is to say Nixon wins the people that are listening for talking points and debating skill. But John F. Kennedy is going to win sort of the media award for this, the portrayal. He will be portrayed as young and vibrant, despite the fact that he's actually a pretty sickly dude who has some serious health issues that will dog him for the rest of his relatively short life. But it's a close-run election, and I mean it is a close-run election. And Kennedy wins thanks in no small part to fraud that happens in the city of Chicago. His dad, Joe Kennedy, goes and bribes the mayor of Chicago, who would be mayor for years and years and years, a guy by the name of Daley, and his son would also go on to be the mayor of Chicago. But what happens is Daley fudges the election results in Cook County, Illinois, which is the most populous county in Illinois. It is Chicago and the northwest suburbs of Chicago. And what he does is he gets a bunch of votes, quote unquote, of people that are dead. He basically inflates the vote number for Kennedy and helps Kennedy win Illinois outright. Nixon is aware of this, but decides not to sue John F. Kennedy and have this investigated, and says, hey, I'd look like a sore loser and it's best for the country if we just move on. We don't want to have a contested election here. So Richard Nixon goes back and joins a law firm and eventually gets back into the Senate. So John F. Kennedy at this point has become the youngest president in American history. He's also the first Catholic president in American history. He is what can only be described as an incredibly inspiring speaker. He carries himself very, very well. He's very well liked. You've probably heard this speech before: ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. John F. Kennedy is going to bring out ideas like the Peace Corps, which says, hey, we'll send American volunteers to help out other countries. We will send people to teach you English, or we will send people to help you cultivate your land better and to, dig wells and irrigation systems and all that sort of stuff. He's a touchy-feely is almost the way you would put it, but not in a creepy way. Just like, hey, he wants everybody to, do well, and he believes in American exceptionalism and all that sort of stuff. So JFK hits his stride with speaking and just his general image. I mean, look at this picture right here. This is the image of JFK. So that's him. That's his wife. Their two kids. They form what is referred to in the media as Camelot. So they're the American ideal. They're wealthy. They're well-mannered. They're rich. Jackie Kennedy is a style icon. People look to her all the time. The White House had been fixed up under the Truman and Eisenhower presidencies, and so Jackie Kennedy takes an opportunity to televise a tour through the White House and sort of bring America into the White House and really associate that the White House is America's home, and as a result, the Kennedys are America's family. So this is a vision for America run by the young, the well-educated World War II generation. This is not Eisenhower, who's in his late 60s by the end of his presidency. This is a new, brighter day for America. We're going to make the 1950s even better. John F. Kennedy is going to pull a ton of people out of the Ivy League that are also relatively young. One of those guys is going to be this dude right here, Bob McNamara, to be his Secretary of Defense. Incredibly well-educated group of people around him. His brother, Bobby Kennedy, also sometimes referred to as RFK, is going to be put in as the Attorney General. The upside to this young vision for America is that it brings out a lot of new ideas. The downside is that there aren't a lot of people that have been there for a long time who actually know how things get done. So we are instead going to see the Kennedy administration talk a really good game, but when it comes to actually enforcing stuff, it's going to be somewhat of a damp squib. That is the reason for the title for this slide, is not a lot comes out of the Kennedy administration. So let's briefly go over it. Now, granted, John F. Kennedy has about 3.5 years to be president before his assassination, so not a lot of time to work with here. First off is the Bay of Pigs. This was an invasion of Cuba, which, if you will recall, was taken over by communist Fidel Castro in the late 1950s. This was planned during the Eisenhower administration and sort of put off, and the CIA pushes it on Kennedy again. He goes along with it. It is a failure. These sponsored Cuban revolutionaries sent with CIA backing are caught almost immediately after attacking. JFK refuses to give any sort of air support or military support. He wants this to be a Cuban-only operation, so the U.S. will not be seen as getting involved. Clearly, that's how the world sees it, even though we don't get involved. And the U.S. looks weak. We can't even take out a dumpy little island that we've already invaded once, remember back with Teddy Roosevelt, and we don't look like we can follow through. Also, the CIA under the Kennedy and later on Johnson and Nixon administrations as well is going to fail repeatedly to kill Fidel Castro in just absolutely cartoonish ways, like a poisoned wetsuit with poison on the inside of it and literally an exploding cigar like out of Looney Tunes. It's not going to work. So Cuba will sort of be the black dog of Kennedy's presidency, is always sort of hounding him and reminding him of his failures. When it comes to civil rights, John F. Kennedy is usually seen by a lot of people as sort of, hey, a great civil rights leader, yada, yada. No. you can find interviews with people like Representative John Lewis, who passed away recently, talking about how John F. Kennedy was not there. History shows that John F. Kennedy and his Attorney General, Robert F. Kennedy, again, talked a really good game, but really didn't do a lot to enforce the civil rights legislation that was passed by Eisenhower and Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson in the 1950s. They didn't want to antagonize the South, in no small part because Democrats needed Southern votes, they thought, to hold on to the presidency. The South had been a strong point for the Democrats for a long, long, long time, and they needed that. It's worth pointing out, as I spoke about Johnson, that Johnson is John F. Kennedy's vice president, but he's viewed as sort of a hick, and he does not fit in with the Camelot crowd. He is a Washington lifer and also just sort of a dirtbag. We'll talk more about that later. So Johnson is there, but Kennedys are not listening to him when it comes to what they should do about civil rights. It gets to the point where Robert Kennedy is actively trying to get Johnson kicked off of the ticket for when John runs again in 1964. And they're going to hate each other for the rest of their lives. But Kennedy even goes so far as to try to convince Martin Luther King to not do the Million Man March on Washington, the I Have a Dream speech, all that. He's like, no, this would look bad. And it would point out the fact that I haven't really been able to follow through with my promises for, social progress. And that is not lost on Lyndon Johnson or on the African American community. Kennedy's biggest success, by far, is the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I will try to keep this brief because there are entire books written on this. What happens is U-2 spy planes, like the one that got shot down in the Eisenhower administration, start to see that launch pads are being built for ballistic missiles that could have nuclear weapons put on the top of them in Cuba. So rather than a missile being fired all the way from Russia to hit the U.S., now we're on an island 90 miles off the coast of Florida. And so Kennedy says, whoa, we can't have this. And that's actually what this meeting is this is a meeting dealing with the Cuban Missile Crisis. You'll notice Johnson is not there. Johnson was largely kept in the dark for that. And John F. Kennedy, over the span of about 2 weeks, negotiates with the Russians. He blockades Cuba and says that we will fire on any Russian ship attempting to enter Cuba because it could have nuclear weapons on it, which would put the U.S. at a gross disadvantage. Eventually, after we get as close as we are ever going to get to nuclear war, John F. Kennedy is able to talk the Russians down to get those ships to turn around, and we're literally within minutes of U.S. ships firing on Russian ships off the coast of Cuba. But the Russians back down. Kennedy does a dang fine job. And the U.S. agrees to remove some nuclear weapons that we had in our NATO ally Turkey that were too close to comfort for Russia. Now, fun fact, we were going to remove those missiles anyway, so this was a pretty easy deal to make. But we decided to do that, and Russia stops constructing missile sites on Cuban soil. Also, what's going to happen here is the hotline is going to be created between D.C. and Moscow. So when you see that red phone in the movies where a president picks it up and talks to the leader of Russia, that is why this is created, so they don't have to go through a bunch of different steps anymore. Now, the president can talk to the leader of Russia, and we won't have issues where we almost end up nuking each other like we did during the Cuban Missile Crisis. John F. Kennedy handles this masterfully. This truly is like the high point of his presidency. And then in 1963, during a trip to Dallas, Texas, where there is a decent possibility that Kennedy was there to visit the governor of Texas, a former friend of Lyndon Johnson, and get that guy to become his vice president instead of Lyndon Johnson. Johnson's still there. He is riding in a different car than John F. Kennedy during this parade through Dallas. John F. Kennedy is assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald from the window of the school book depository in Texas. He is shot a couple times, and the mayor of Texas is also hurt, if not killed. Kennedy dies on the spot. He's pronounced dead in the hospital in Dallas. And on the flight back to Washington, D.C., with John F. Kennedy's body with Jackie Kennedy still wearing the dress spattered with her husband's blood. Lyndon Johnson is sworn in as the president on Air Force One. The picture on the bottom right there is John F. Kennedy's funeral. He's buried at Arlington Cemetery as a veteran. There is an eternal flame that burns over his grave. You can go see that if you go to D.C. So the Kennedy administration is relatively short. It's about 3 years and change. And not a lot domestically really to show for it, but the Cuban Missile Crisis and the averting of a major war with Russia is your high point, definitely. So, on to Lyndon Johnson. I really like Lyndon Johnson as a politician. He might be my favorite president. He's definitely my second favorite president, behind James K. Polk. He's a terrible person. There's no getting around this. A serial haver of affairs, and really liked to brag about it, unlike John F. Kennedy, who was a serial haver of affairs that didn't like to brag about it. He's just kind of a jerk. He's very manipulative. He's very assertive. He does not respect people's personal space. Here's your extra credit thing. He had a habit of picking up his dogs by their ears and spinning them around because he thought it was hilarious. That's terrible. He was, though, one of the probably two greatest politicians of the 20th century, along with Franklin Roosevelt. Johnson grows up in Texas, dirt poor. His dad is kind of a screw-up and can never really hold anything together. Johnson is going to get elected as a state representative, then a representative in the House of Representatives for a couple terms. Then he's going to run for the Senate following World War II. He's a big fan of Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal and the social policies that were there. He's going to use the New Deal to electrify large portions of Texas that didn't have electricity before, things like that. He will become the Senate Majority Leader and be the guy that gets the Civil Rights Acts in the 1950s passed. He's an incredibly manipulative guy, and this is never better shown than the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So there's going to be an election in 1964. Johnson wants to win it. But he also, despite being, again, a terrible person, regularly used the N-word, all that sort of stuff, is sort of a closet progressive, if you will. He doesn't like to trumpet this, but he really believes in social change. So he is going to decide, hey, I want to make sure that African Americans are treated better, that America is able to treat all of its citizens better in 1964. So he basically uses the death of John F. Kennedy as sort of a cudgel to force people into passing the Civil Rights Act. He's friends with a ton of Southerners. Richard Russell from Georgia is a big one, who's also a huge racist, despite the fact that he has a Senate office building named after him. But anyway, he is going to manipulate Western states that don't really care about civil rights into this. He's going to call in favors and talk about, this is what John F. Kennedy wanted more than anything. And that's one of the first speeches Johnson's going to make, is how passing the Civil Rights Act was something that John F. Kennedy wanted to do. Despite the fact that Kennedy had never made any headway on it, LBJ is basically going to show off and say, hey, do this for the memory of John F. Kennedy. And it's going to work. You guys read about this last week, so I'm not going to go much more into it. But this is also going to start a exodus for the South, where the South used to be lock, stock, and barrel Democratic territory. It's now going to start shifting over to the GOP, to the Republicans. But not before major civil rights legislation is passed. Johnson is going to get reelected in 1964 by defeating a guy named Barry Goldwater. That's this little pin you see over here. Barry Goldwater is a very, very conservative, kind of a war hawk Republican from Arizona. Johnson is famous for showing a commercial where a little girl is picking flowers off of a daisy and singing to herself, and a nuclear bomb goes off and kills her. And then at the end, it says something along the lines of, "Barry, Barry, before Barry buries us." And America's like, whoa, Barry Goldwater wants to get us all nuked. Let's vote for Lyndon Johnson. It seemed like he did a pretty good job in the last couple months he was president. So Johnson will get elected in his own right in the 1964 presidential election. And he will follow that up with another major accomplishment, the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So after beating Barry Goldwater, he is going to use all of his skill as a politician again, and I really cannot stress how skillful he was, how easily and how dedicated he was in getting all of this done, getting the right people to vote for the right stuff at the right times by telling them the right things. So this ensures voting rights for minorities, so no longer will you have literacy tests, and you can't, tell people that elections are on the wrong days. It's also going to make sure that the federal government has oversight on state elections, so southern states can't deny African Americans or western states can't deny Hispanics the right to vote as long as they're American citizens. That's the picture you see up here. This is Johnson giving one of the pens he just used to sign the 1965 Voting Rights Act to Martin Luther King Jr. He is lastly going to get the 24th Amendment passed right after that. Now, this is sort of a result of 64 and 65 because the amendment needs to be okayed by both Congress and by the various states. You needed at least 38 states to sign off on this at this point. And he really gets that done, is he pushes for a national campaign, and it works. So the 24th Amendment ends poll taxes. So no longer can, especially southern states, make people have to pay to vote. It used to be a thing. It's not anymore. Brief interlude into Vietnam here, because as we've seen here on the social front, on the home front in America, Lyndon Johnson is doing a bang-up job. Most people, with the exception of racists, are pretty happy with the way he's running the country. But this is his Achilles heel, is Vietnam. Again, we'll go way more into this next week. But long story short, Eisenhower starts our involvement with Vietnam, sends some troops over there. Kennedy escalates it and really backs up the military in southern Vietnam against the communists in the north. And Johnson chooses to escalate that. He does it based on something called the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which you should know, at which point a U.S. ship claims it was fired upon, and that gives us a cause to go to war, a casus belli. Investigations years later will show that, in fact, we were never fired at, and basically we made the whole thing up. Johnson and the Department of Defense kind of made it up because we wanted to go and smack the North Vietnamese around, and we needed a reason to do that. So we are going to go to war. We are not officially going to declare war, because that would be too easy, but we are still going to go to war. And the draft is going to kick in. So now America is very committed to war in Vietnam. We don't just have a couple thousand troops over there anymore. We are going to send tens of thousands of troops over there, and the war is rapidly going to escalate. And as good as Johnson is on the home front, he is a disaster overseas, as we'll see next week. Johnson's other big thing that he unfortunately creates at a speech at the University of Michigan, for which I will never forgive him, is the creation of what he called the Great Society. And this was sort of his big catch-all term for a plan to just help everybody in America, the poor, the dispossessed, the have-nots. He had a ton of pieces of legislation that he wanted to get passed and did get passed that he was going to use to sort of help America. Whereas this was just ensuring basic, civil rights and basic rights to vote. This is here to help these people not only have rights, but get their shot at the American dream. So this is going to create government housing. It's going to create education programs that will help states pay for better education, Head Start stuff, preschools across America funded by the federal government. Increased social welfare programs, so Medicare and Medicaid are going to start. The National Endowment for the Arts, the people that pay for Sesame Street. The Consumer Product Safety Commission, which is the only government Twitter account still worth following. It's amazing. But he's looking out for the arts here. He's looking out for the elderly and the poor that can't afford medicine. He's looking out for consumers to make sure that they're not buying, and eating lead paint, that things that they buy are safe. And also the 1965 Immigration Act, which we talked about last semester. All of this is part of the Great Society. So again, at home, Lyndon Johnson, all-star. Overseas, Lyndon Johnson, failure. Because this change, while positive, is incredibly expensive. Taxes have to go way, way up to pay for all of this. And as the death toll in Vietnam starts to rise and the draft starts to become more of a hot-button issue, Johnson starts to question, oh God, what is my legacy going to be? How are people going to think of me? And he's also been convinced that he's going to die in his early 60s from heart disease because that's what happened to his dad and what happened to his grandpa. Turns out he's right. But he will not die in office. But Johnson is starting to question, does he want to run for a second term in 1968? We'll get there in a little bit. But first, an interlude. Culture. Now, presumably you have done the music stuff already, so I'm not going to go super into music here. but we are going to talk about how American culture is changing from the sort of go along to get along, keeping up with the Joneses culture of the 1950s into a much more sort of antagonistic culture in the 1960s. So the big thing with the 1960s you all associate with it is hippies, flower child, all that stuff. It's all about peace and love and also doing, acid and smoking weed, and communal living, and sort of pushing back against that capitalist consumerist society that we talked about in exchange for everybody sort of living together in peace and harmony, man. It is a pushback against basically their youth. So these are people in their 20s that grew up in the 50s and said, hey, I don't want to be a part of that. I don't want to be a slave to the man. I don't want a 9-to-5 work job. I want to go, make the world a better place and have everybody just get along, And it works for a while until you realize that you need money. The center point for this was San Francisco, but the West Coast especially is going to see a ton of these communes pop up. There's also going to be a decent number in like Connecticut and Vermont and New Hampshire, basically where you can get farmland on the coasts. The music is also going to shift from sort of the doo-wop, Frankie Valli music of the 1950s. We'd seen a little rock and roll with Elvis, but it was just sort of coming up. But by the time we get to 1960s, rock and roll is going to become a capital rock and roll sort of thing. Elvis is an international star. The Rolling Stones and the Beatles are coming over from England and popularizing it. Socially conscious music, like you guys saw earlier with like Joan Baez and Bob Dylan, is going to start to pop up and mix popular music with making a point, trying to make society a better place. Songs that also overtly address sex and drug use, like you guys saw with The Doors or that Velvet Underground song on there, are in there. Is these people who grew up again in the 1950s are pushing back on that culture of conformity and saying, no, this is what matters to us right now, or this is my experience. And it becomes incredibly popular among the youth, whereas the adults in the room, if you will, so those people that had fought in World War II, sort of that generation, is horrified by the brazenness of 1960s culture. 1960s culture is sort of best exemplified by Woodstock, which is a massive 3-day music festival in upstate New York on a farm. Some of the biggest bands in the world are going to be there. Jimi Hendrix is there. Sha Na Na, who is sort of the flag bearer for the 1950s, is there. Carlos Santana is there. But it's a music festival full of, drugs and free love and hippies and sort of everything that American consumer culture was horrified by. But it was viewed as sort of a success, as everybody's like, wow, look at all these people living together in peace and harmony and in the mud and all that sort of stuff. And then a couple months later, at Altamont Speedway in California, the Rolling Stones hold a free concert. And this is sort of viewed as the end of the flower child generation here, is they'd hired the Hells Angels to be their security. Some people got too close to the stage, and a couple members of the Hells Angels stabbed a couple people to death. This is on film. There's actually a movie you can see on it called Gimme Shelter that follows the Rolling Stones during this. It's interesting. It's upsetting, but it's interesting. But this is sort of viewed as, hey, look, maybe this doesn't work so well, as everybody thought, hey, we're going to get this awesome free concert, and instead people are murdered on camera. So by the end of the 1960s, the hippie movement has sort of burnt itself out. It's not gone away, but it's burnt itself out. If you want sort of a weird analogy for this, the 60s are the generation of weed and LSD as the drug of choice, whereas the 70s are going to shift towards cocaine and heroin. This is sort of the childish, if you will, drug era, and drugs are going to get harder and more dangerous over time here. And that is sort of what happens by the end of the 1960s, is people are looking for more of a rush, more of a pushback on culture than ever before. It is not just these, largely suburban kids going out and pushing against their parents' generation, though there's real social change happening in the 1960s as well. Native American rights movement is going to really pick up steam. The Indian New Deal under FDR did some good work, but this protest movement in the 1960s is going to see occupations of places like Wounded Knee. Native Americans are going to take over Alcatraz for a while. All of this to highlight that the federal government has really continued to fail in their promises to help the Native Americans and to stop exploiting them, that America has not followed through on their treaties with the Native Americans. And eventually this will lead to some changes. By the time we get to the Nixon administration in the 70s, you're going to see some better stuff for the Native Americans. But this Native Americans' rights movement, especially Wounded Knee, is going to bring a lot of attention to how poorly the Native Americans have been trusted and treated by the American government. Latino activism is going to pop up at this time. There had been a number of Latin American race riots in the 1940s in California over the organized labor there. We talked about that briefly during World War II. But as California becomes more and more sort of the nation's breadbasket, the Central Valley of California, immigrant and migrant labor that is happening there, largely composed of Latinos, is going to see that they're being treated horribly by management. And so under the leadership, largely, of Cesar Chavez, and he's going to go on a hunger strike, Latin Americans are going to be able to push with national recognition for better rights and treatment of workers, and that is going to make a major effect on sort of the impact of Latin American culture in especially the sort of Southwest, so Arizona, California, largely. And then the women's movement. That gap is there for a reason, because there's no good way to explain this. Often called second wave feminism, this is out of the 1950s and 1960s. Bra burning was not really a thing. It really only happened like once that's been documented, and they didn't actually end up burning their bras. But that is sort of what's associated with this, is we've seen women taking steps closer and closer to being considered equal members of society. We're still not going to get there until really Richard Nixon, but we're getting there. And even then, it's iffy. And this is sort of the flashpoint for this, is a woman named Betty Friedan. Betty Friedan authors a book called The Feminine Mystique, which is a name I'd like you to know. And it talks about how the American housewife feels unfulfilled, that staying home and just being a wife and a mother is not all that women in America want, that they want a career, they want self-fulfillment, they want to make their own decisions, and they just want more. They want to be treated equally, and they're not being allowed for that. And a lot of women are going to look at the feminine mystique and say, yeah, that's right. This is articulating how we feel as though we've been shortchanged for a long time here, and we want more. So that is going to sort of push the culture of the women's movement forward. The other thing is this 1-2 punch we have down here. The pill is going to become readily available between the early and mid-60s. Women can now affordably get birth control, and that gives them the autonomy to choose when and if they want to become pregnant and have a child or a family, or if maybe they don't, if they just want a career and never want children. So this sort of goes along with that sexual revolution we were talking about with hippies up here. It's not a one-to-one thing by any means, but birth control gives women a lot more autonomy over their own body, that they can make decisions now, especially with the ease of obtaining the pill. The other thing that's going to go into this, and this will play into a major thing we do when we talk about the 70s in a week or two, is Griswold versus Connecticut. I will also make you know this next year in government. Griswold versus Connecticut, the Supreme Court says that women have a right to use contraceptives, and the state can't do anything about it. Also, it does not matter if you are married or not, single women also have access to contraceptives, because, as the Supreme Court says, American citizens have a right to privacy. The government should not be getting involved in what happens in your own house, and that includes your choice if you want to become pregnant or not, if you want to have a family or not. That is your choice as a consenting adult in America, and the government should not get involved. And that's going to become a big, big thing later on when we get to abortion rights, which is sort of the next step in the women's movement. So I do want you to associate birth control and Griswold versus Connecticut together. They really do go hand in hand here. All right. Let's wrap up the 1960s. 1968 is a bad year for America, and you'll see why as we go through. So Vietnam, the death toll reaches its highest point. You're going to see 16,500 American military killed in Vietnam. That is to say nothing of all those that are injured or that are coming back with post-traumatic stress disorder and all of that. America begins to question the war. Are we doing this for the right reasons? Are we successful? Are we being embarrassed? Why do we still have the draft? All of that sort of stuff. And now it is time for a litany of bad stuff happening in the home front. Martin Luther King Jr. is going to be assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, while organizing a labor protest for garbage men. He's shot from across the street from his hotel. He dies soon afterwards. The news is going to get out, and there will be riots in major cities across America, and just sort of like a mourning thing. One of the people that will actually help calm those riots is former Attorney General Bobby Kennedy. He's going to go and speak to America and sort of say, yes, we feel all your pain, but violence is not the way to answer it. This is not what Dr. King would have wanted. And he's often, and rightly so, given credit for sort of mitigating the amount of damage that could have happened after the assassination of Martin Luther King. Hand in hand with that, a couple years earlier, Malcolm X, who was the much more militant, much more outspoken leader of the Nation of Islam, was assassinated at a speech in 1965. In 1966, a group called the Black Panthers are going to show up, and they're going to sort of ride the Malcolm X by any means necessary way of forcing social change in America and forcing African Americans to be treated equally. Again, they start in 66. By the time King is assassinated in 68, they're going to take a much more active role and sort of become one of the faces of the new civil rights movement, if you will, a more sort of violent and less socially interested civil rights group, more interested in forcing change, like Malcolm X said, by any means possible. Soon after this, Bobby Kennedy, who has now decided to run against Lyndon Johnson for the presidency in 1968, will be assassinated in a hotel kitchen that he's walking through after a speech in 1968. And this is the end of Camelot. We'd seen John F. Kennedy assassinated, Bobby Kennedy's dead 5 years later. Sort of the great hope for America is viewed as gone at this point. Then comes the Democratic National Convention. This is held in Chicago. A ton of anti-war protesters show up. A bunch of hippies show up. Chicago is basically a sea of people sleeping out in parks waiting to protest whoever gets the Democratic nomination. Remember, Bobby Kennedy is dead. Lyndon Johnson is still debating whether or not he wants the job. So the Democrats are sort of stuck between a rock, a hard place, and a hard place, and another hard place, and then probably some fire on top of that. Eventually, this is going to result in rioting. The Chicago police, under Mayor Daley, are going to go out and attempt to kind of roust the hippies and the anti-war protesters out of the city parks, and it is going to result in unmatched violence. That is what you see here. This is shown on national television. So we have hit the point now where it's not just, hey, the occasional presidential debate is being held on television, but major American events are being shown on national television, and we can see just the amount of violence that is happening even in this small picture, and it gets way, way, way more extreme than that as time goes on. Eventually, these riots die down. Johnson is going to decide that he's not going to run again for president, and instead his vice president, a guy by the name of Hubert Humphrey, who's a very principled civil rights guy, is going to run, but he's not particularly popular. Then, as well as Hubert Humphrey running, a third-party candidate, George Wallace of Alabama, is a massive racist. He's basically running on a undo everything Lyndon Johnson did for the country over the last couple of years. So undo, all of this stuff, and let's go back to the way it was before Brown versus Board of Education. He's going to run as a third party there and pick up a number of votes in the South, actually winning a couple states there. But the winner of the 1968 presidential election, who will push America into the 1970s, is this guy who we talked about a while ago. Richard Milhouse Nixon is going to come back again and win pretty easily. He's going to win about 300 electoral votes to about 190 that Hubert Humphrey's going to get, and Wallace will pick up the last couple. He runs as a moderate Republican, kind of pushing the, hey, let's go back to the way America was during the 1950s when I was your vice president and we all loved Dwight Eisenhower. But he's also going to employ the Southern strategy, which the Republican Party is going to use for decades to come. And that is basically in the South saying, hey, we might not enforce those civil rights laws if you vote for us, so think about that. So this is how the Republican Party is able to pick up rural white voters in the South, is largely running a campaign based on doing away with civil rights legislation, or at least ignoring civil rights legislation when they could. Also, Nixon runs by saying that, hey, Johnson's been doing a pretty crap job at ending the Vietnam War. This is to say nothing of the fact that Johnson's future Secretary of State and some other people are over in Vietnam, over in Paris where these negotiations are happening, kind of throwing the brakes onto ending the Vietnam War. Is Johnson had been negotiating for this, and the Nixon administration, before it's even been elected, is sort of throwing the brakes on this so they can say, look, nothing good is happening for Vietnam with the Democrats. Try a Republican, see what we can do. So that is how Nixon's going to get elected, is moderate Republican, plus that Southern strategy in the South of ignoring civil rights legislation and promising to end the Vietnam War. Now, as we will see next week, that's not going to be a lot easier said than done. And we are going to end this with a win here. In 1969, on July 20th, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin are going to land on the moon. The space race has been happening since the Eisenhower administration. John F. Kennedy promised that there would be a man on the moon by the end of the decade. He does not live to see it, but his dream is achieved here, is we do get a man on the moon, and America has beaten the Russians in space. We've also made the Russians spend an ungodly amount of money, and they don't get nearly as far. So while we were playing catch-up for most of that decade, America lands on the moon. And that's where we're going to end it. America lands on the moon. Next week we'll do Vietnam, and then we get to the 70s after that, and we will talk about Richard Nixon and getting out. All right, folks, that's it. Thanks for playing along. Good luck on your quiz. Remember, Lyndon Johnson had beagle dogs, and he lifted them up by their ears. All right, that is it for me. Good luck on your quiz. Take those notes. Talk to you later. Bye.